Today is actually the 150th anniversary of, well, one part of the Paris Commune, and there's different dates relating to different instances. This is, I'm sure Kevin will tell you the details about what the 150th anniversary of this particular date is, 18th of March, but it's often seen as the first day of the Paris Commune, which is...
Okay, thanks, Tina. Yes, with the foresight that the Labour-Left Alliance is famous for, we managed to schedule this Thursday session on the day of one of the significant events of the Paris Commune, which was the resistance of an attempt by the Thiers government, the so-called Government of National Defence, effectively the bourgeois government of France, to seize the cannons belonging to the National Guard in the Montmartre area of Paris. And the failure of that attempt, and indeed some of the violence in resisting that attempt, in a sense, began the events that led within 8 days to the election of the Commune. So it's a very significant turning point. I suppose that most comrades on the left have, had some familiarity with the Paris Commune, and I was just looking back through my notes today and realized that that I first read about it for the centenary, which is of course 50 years ago, which doesn't seem very long, but it also, I suppose, illustrates the historical resonance of the Paris Commune. I was also looking at some French newspapers and debates in modern Paris about how the Commune should be remembered, if it should be remembered at all. And indeed, there's as you would expect, a debate between right and left. There's a socialist mayor in Paris who has been attempting to remember it in a particular way. And then the various Republican and Macronist and so on parties, opposing that. So this is obviously still a very controversial and a very significant movement. And the fact that all this week, and indeed it probably even as I'm speaking, there will be commemorative meetings and so on taking place. So I think that the importance of it can't really be overstated. I want to begin with just saying what I think the importance is. And of course, that is the importance in the Marxist tradition as developed by Marx, whose pamphlet, The Civil War in France, was issued as an address to members of the International. The Civil War in France outlines Marx's main ideas on this. And he in particular talks about the fact that this is the first workers' government. And he describes the sort of actions and the activities of the Commune. He describes that it's a seizure of power in the city is the embodiment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's forms of election. It's recallable delegates and deputies. It's bringing together the executive and the legislative function, and the idea that the officials and the various elected deputies should receive salaries or expenses of those of an average worker. There was actually a salary cap. So the Commune remains for many people in the late 19th century the sort of model, and it's the first occasion in which a group of revolutionaries, overwhelmingly working class, despite some later attempts to sort of play that element down, but overwhelmingly working class, both in actual origin and in sympathy, attempt to construct some form of government. But of course, the Commune failed. It was very ruthlessly crushed in the so-called Bloody Week. The army of Thiers' army under the control of General McMahon, who later goes on to become a president of France, carries out a ruthless suppression in which probably around about 30,000 people are killed, pretty well shot out of hand in many cases. And of course, there's the famous sort of last stand of the Communard in the Père Lachaise cemetery, which is again, highly significant. There are arrests, there are deportations. 7,000 people are deported to the various penal colonies in Latin America, South America, and in the Pacific. And of course, there are imprisonments. And indeed, the Commune remains a sort of dividing fault in French society, and indeed a touchstone for how people orientate towards the French state and towards French history. Also, for revolutionaries like Lenin, it was something of a test case because, of course, Marxists drew very heavily on the historical experience of the working class movement. And for Marxists in continental Europe and elsewhere, this was a living experience of how to conduct or how not to conduct a revolutionary struggle. What it certainly led to was not only the idea that the Commune could be a model for the dictatorship of the proletariat, to put into conventional English, working class rule. Not only would it be a model for working class rule, but also that it would be an example of what would become a key tenet in Marxism, and one that Lenin later picked up in State and Revolution, which was the idea that the old state machinery could not be simply picked up as an instrument and used. And indeed, in the foreword to the Civil War in France, written by Engels, I think in the early 1890s, he says that this is one of the key lessons. And he uses a German word meaning shattering, but not just I think a sort of primeval explosion, but actually a sort of controlled, almost as a targeted destruction with the aim of rebuilding something else. So the Commune then has entered into both French history, international revolutionary history, as a very significant event, and the way that it shaped the practice and the politics of Marxists is, I think, going to be very important. And so I think we perhaps need to understand something of the nature of the Commune and talk about some of the debates surrounding it. There's quite a lot of complex French or Franco-German diplomatic and political history, but I think it's probably best to start with Paris itself. We're probably all familiar with the Paris of the Revolution, the names of the various revolutionary sites, and we have an idea of Paris as a revolutionary city. And indeed, there was something of a revolutionary tradition in Paris. And by tradition, I mean that there was a sense, Paris, the Parisian population, particularly the radical and the working class population, had a sense of itself as being the revolutionary vanguard. This certainly went back to the great days of the French Revolution. And one of the features of various stages of that revolution would be popular movements in which the sans-culottes, the plebeian elements, moved onto the stage of history, as it were. So there would be periods when Parisian crowds seized the initiative, when, for example, they occupied key buildings, or they carried out armed demonstrations, which in effect were small forms of uprising, which then forced the revolution in a much more radical direction. And of course, the great revolutions of 1830 and then of 1848, Paris again is very much in the vanguard. But of course, it's also in the vanguard of defeats. And remember that many of the counter-revolutionaries that we're going to encounter, Thiers and others, are also involved in the suppression of some of those earlier movements as well. Paris in the 1870s is a large city. It has, I think, approximately about 10% of the population of France in that period, maybe just a little less. So it's a population, it's a city of about 2 million people. About a quarter of those are proletarians who work in as industrial workers, but there's also quite a large grouping of servants and indeed various petty bourgeois sections of the population. In other words, that unlike, say, Manchester, Paris would not have, probably only had about 40,000 or so, I think, workers who worked in large enterprises. So most workers worked in small enterprises, and indeed there was a very large group of artisans who had a rather indeterminate status between being wage workers and indeed small traders and small artisans. There were, for example, about 100,000 servants living in the city. Again, this is not unusual in the late 19th century city. You know, but Britain had similar large numbers of servants. In other words, that the proletariat in Paris is, it's proletarian, but it's formed in very different conditions, I think. And I think the locality, and indeed the revolutionary traditions of the locality, the different arrondissements, the different sort of sections of the city are often quite important. So the commune, when it emerges, often reflects these sort of local elements in that way. Less, for example, based upon workplaces, as we might see later in the Soviets, and more on the geographical areas in that way. Now, the government of France in the years 1870 to 1871 was in turmoil. And this was a product of the war between France and what Prussia, which would eventually become the German Empire. France was governed by, at the beginning of that war, which I think began in the spring of 1870, May, I think. The government of France was in the hands of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who'd come to power in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution. And this is the Bonaparte who is made famous in Marx as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. So his regime rests on balancing between the various social groupings. Ultimately, it's reliant upon capitalism. Obviously, it supports capitalism, but on occasions it makes concessions to the workers, it makes concessions to the peasantry. And of course, it tries, above all, to unite the population around the mystique of the Bonaparte name. And one of the ways of doing this is through foreign policy adventures. And there is, as a result of one of these foreign policy adventures, there is a war. France declares war on Prussia, and in the course of that war, Germany will be united. The process had begun from the early 1860s, but you know, the war is quite significant in German history for the creation of the Kaiserreich, the imperial system, which is essentially the domination of Prussia, the most industrialized and the strongest state in the German Confederation. The war goes badly for France, and by the autumn, by September of 1870, the French have been effectively defeated. And it's in the crucible of this war, I think, that much of the revolutionary ferment and indeed much of the dynamics of the commune, you know, come to play. What's interesting, if you read the 1891 preface by Engels, he talks about the impact of war on revolution, and indeed he talks about he senses in the early 1890s developing war fever in Europe, and suggests that the wars that we're going to see in the future may open up all sorts of revolutionary possibilities. So the relationship between war and revolution, the relationship between a government that collapses and then a vacuum and an opportunity for the working class to seize power, that type of similarity with things that are going to occur later on, I think is very, very clear to later revolutionaries in this way. Now, the French state is defeated, and in the resulting chaos, a government of national defense is formed. This is formed to continue the war, and it is in effect means the deposition of Louis Napoleon, who's captured and is in Germany in the relative luxury of I think a castle in Wilhelm, I think it's Wilhelmsloh in Hesse Castle. That's where he spends his time. Marx makes a joke there about the bravery of the generals who spend their time turning cigarettes. I think he means rolling them. But so Louis Napoleon is out of the way. But of course, the war does continue, and the Prussians lay siege to Paris. The government flees from Paris. Rather dramatically, one of its leaders, Gambetta, escapes from the city in a balloon. He flies away, and Paris is then besieged. And to defend Paris, the workers and others form a militia, the National Guard, in order to defend the city. Now, the Prussians don't actually move in on the city; they just stand back, and rather like a medieval siege, they hope to starve out the population. And this, of course, is the period which gives rise to the horrific legends about the sort of food that people were eating. People paying good money for rats, and when they'd run through them, starting to move on to the zoo animals. So the conditions of the siege were fairly horrendous. But the siege was more at this stage of a sort of standoff. Bismarck was using the Prussian leader, Otto von Bismarck, was using the siege as a way of applying pressure, both to get the government of national defense to sign a treaty, but also to contain and in a sense manipulate the situation to German advantage. Now, when rumors reached Paris that this government of national defense was going to was trying to begin negotiations with the Germans. Sorry, the term Prussians and Germans are interchangeable. I think probably we'll stick to the term Germans initially. It'll probably be easier. But when news is reached of this, the National Guard, in a sense, carries out a revolt. And this revolt is, in many ways, the first signs of independent revolutionary organization. The National Guard forms a central committee, and in that central committee, it then becomes a committee of public safety. Again, these are all terms which have resonance from the French Revolution, and it's very clear that in drawing upon those terms, the radical left were attempting, in a sense, to locate themselves in that revolution, but they were also dealing with particular political problems, which was that the government was going to, in a sense, betray Paris. And they wanted to resist that, but they were also uncertain both what would happen to them, but perhaps more importantly, what would happen to the working class of the city. Now, this period in the autumn of 1870 and into early 1871 is a period of, I suppose, fairly uneasy peace. The government of national defense does regain control over the city. It displaces this so-called government committee of public safety. But it's very clear that the National Guard and the working class population of Paris are deeply suspicious of the government of national defense. One of the things about the city at this point is that large numbers of its middle and upper class population had fled. So the city is pretty well proletarian. And, there are middle class people there, but at this point, it's really, I think, the people who are committed to the city or simply don't have anywhere else to go. On top of that, there are large numbers of people who have been made refugees. They fled before the German armies coming into eastern France, and so there's a quite a large group of displaced people. And importantly, and these people will become important, particularly some Polish people and some Italians and others, there are about 100,000 immigrants in Paris from other European countries, many of whom are political refugees. You remember that Marx spent some time amongst the political refugee milieu in Paris in the 1840s. So this Paris that we now have is in a way radicalizing. It's radicalizing under the impact of the siege and also of its great distrust of the government of national defense. Now, what happens in the spring is that the counter-revolutionary forces, as it were, start to mobilize. There are a series of elections throughout France in February. They're organized under a fairly snap basis, just with a few days' notice. And this leads to the creation of a National Assembly, which is overwhelmingly conservative. These are the people that Marx in the Civil War in France describes as the rurals. And this rural population is deemed to be reactionary, counter-revolutionary. And indeed, it's very much identified with, well, partly with Bonapartism, but also with monarchism, in the phrase that Marx uses, the party of order. Again, these are people who want to restore the old regime. They might want to restore the monarchy. In particular, they certainly want to crack down on any working class unrest in that way. Now, the other, I suppose, key point here is that at around the same time as the elections, the first hints of the peace treaty with Germany emerge. Two key provinces in the east of France, Alsace-Lorraine, will have to be surrendered. They are now to become incorporated into the new German Empire. And there's a 5 billion franc indemnity. And so again, it's a fairly punishing treaty. And for radical Republicans, and indeed Marx makes much of this in the Civil War in France, the loss of those two areas and turning what Marx said was previously a defensive war into a war of expansion, in a sense, merges the sense of national humiliation also with the growing class tensions in this way. Now, it's also very clear that Thiers, who is the new sort of interim leader, the leader of the government of national defense, wants to restore order. He wants to restore normal government in Paris. He wants to disarm the National Guard. And again, we have here one of the key lessons or one of the key themes that often occurs in the Marxist literature, that the National Guard is in effect the armed working class. And if you have an armed working class, then that is a factor that can't be ignored. Again, the experience of the 1848 revolutions, where there were similar National Guards in the main revolutionary centers in Europe, illustrate that an armed population then has its own power, it has a veto. And I suppose what Marx and others are very clear is that the working class has entered into politics as an important factor. It had been an important factor in the 1848 revolution. The June massacres had proven that. But what the Commune now, or what these developments seem to show, is a working class that is, in a sense, developing a sense of its own interests and its own politics. I say developing because, of course, the arguments will be that the strategy is not fully developed, and that indeed there is hesitancy and that there's a lack of clarity about the strategy that's going to be developed. The government of national defense, fearing that Paris is becoming uncontrollable, leaves the city, moves out to Versailles, not very far away, but sufficiently outside of the city to make it defensible. And again, rather like the great days of the French Revolution, less amenable to the pressures of what this government now sees as the mob. So it moves out, and it's very clear that it's starting to consider a counter-strike back against Paris. And so this happens in the early morning of March the 18th, when the troops from Versailles enter the city, and they attempt to disarm the National Guard, particularly taking the cannons, the artillery from Montmartre. Now this fails. There is some fighting, but it largely fails because of fraternization between the troops and the National Guard. And indeed, you have even some of the troops going over to the National Guard and joining this movement. Two generals who order their troops to fire on the crowd are in turn killed by their own troops, Generals Lecomte and Thomas. They are shot, and so you now have ferment in the city. The government of national defense has moved on to the city, and the city now responds. Now, it's on March the 26th that we actually have the election of the Commune. And a key element at this point, I think, which is important to note, is that the revolutionaries involved in these movements come really from quite a wide range of traditions. And indeed, the French revolutionary Auguste Blanqui, is in many ways the leading figure in some of these movements, although he's rather out of the way at this stage, having been captured. So there are active revolutionaries and people who are, in a sense, directing things, moving things forward, but they come in various tendencies, and I think that none of them really have a very clear plan. In a sense, they're feeling their way, drawing on the experience of other revolutionary movements and other aspects of the French Revolution, admittedly, but they are facing, in many ways, the unknown in that way. Now, the Commune is essentially a municipal council. The use of the term commune, I think, needs some explanation. It can be both seen as simply a local government administration. You still find in French-speaking parts of Europe, the commune, as a local government division. It's also, though, has a certain revolutionary pedigree. In the French Revolution, the Commune of Paris at one point is a sort of a revolutionary government of the city. And of course, it also has those medieval connotations when the cities often rose up against their feudal overlords in France and in the Low Countries. So the idea of the commune has a certain historical resonance in this way. The elections, the turnout is reasonably high in the working class areas. Maybe anywhere between 60 and 80%. It's essentially a manhood suffrage. No, women actually voted. Less, with a lot of abstentions in the middle class areas. The commune is formally 92 members, but effectively it's about 60 effectively councillors. And we can identify around about 30 to 35 in terms of clear sort of political positions. There are some members of the International involved, the International Working Men's Association, but many of the communards are either Blanquists or various forms of Proudhonist. Again, you'll remember Mulholland's talk about revolutionary ideas, last year. So I'd refer you back to that in terms of the nature of those different tendencies. But there are also some radical Republicans, Jacobins, referring back to the great days of the French Revolution. We know quite a bit about the Commune. After all, this is going on in a major city in a period of mass communications, newspapers, telegrams, and of course photographs. There are pictures of these events and of these people. The Commune's membership has a majority that is purely working class, with a number of other lower class groups, certainly small business people, artisans, and so on. But there also are a significant number of white collar workers. And if you read Marx, he makes the point that although the majority is working class, he says that the others are those who put themselves on the viewpoint of the proletariat. And it is fairly clear that all of the people who are elected, and certainly in the last stand of the Commune, these people will sacrifice and indeed will make a very heroic stand. So the fact that they come from other social groupings, I think shouldn't dismiss this idea that it was essentially a working class movement in that way. In the next couple of weeks, a whole series of radical social measures are carried out. You have obviously the election, the recallable nature, the issues of the wages and so forth that I've already talked about, the freezing of rents, and of course the abolition of the standing army and the ending of conscription. So in terms of the state machinery, the argument is that the centralized state is now going to be replaced by a democratically elected council, and that above all, that the legislative and the executive functions will be combined. In particular, the centralized posts of the mayor, of the prefect, or whatever, are abolished, and it's simply a general council in that way. So you can see that this is, really quite a radical break from both French practice and in other parts of Europe as well. The new flag of the Commune is the red flag, and as the phrase says, the flag of the Commune is the flag of the World Republic. And this idea of internationalism is quite strong, so that people who are not born in Paris can become members of the Commune, and indeed they offered the command of the National Guard to the Italian revolutionary Garibaldi. He respectfully declined it, but its other commander was Polish, and indeed there were numbers of Polish soldiers fighting with the Commune who'd had experience of the Polish revolutionary movement and the wars against Tsarism. So it was very clearly an internationalist movement, and it was one that I think was suffused with this idea of working class power. But of course, as Marx alludes to in his account, there are older elements of ideas, echoes of the revolution, the great revolution of the 1790s, as would be natural. And many of those tendencies will come to the fore, will be very significant. So throughout the spring, the Commune attempts to transform Paris, largely politically, but in some quite key areas, and above all, some quite important symbolic areas. So the separation of church and state's declared. Education is declared to be a secular activity. And in two really quite significant, but just symbolic moves, the guillotine is publicly burned, in other words, ending executions, and the victory pillar at the Place Vendôme, which celebrates Napoleon's victories, is pulled down. The argument is that this was a monument to chauvinism and an incitement to national hatred. So there's some quite conscious repudiation of the more reactionary elements of French society. But of course, the key questions for many people will be its social and economic program. And again, there are here some, some important, ameliorating reforms. The abolition of night work for bakers, quite a significant issue given the French traditions of bread and so forth. But also the abolition of workers' regulation cards, effectively passports which tied workers to particular jobs. And the beginnings of ideas of providing state employment, a survey of factories which had been closed down and so on was being undertaken with the aim of restarting them as cooperatives and then linking them together. Industries which were in private hands were not nationalized or collectivized. And again, this isn't, I think, necessarily, indication of reformism. It's an indication that at this point, their main aim is to keep production going, is to keep society together. And of course, remember, they're in a besieged city. They've got an army outside in Versailles that is, mobilizing against them. So this is not, an ideal set of circumstances to begin a social experiment. Why then doesn't the Commune make some decisive moves? Well, I think looking back and looking at comments, particularly by Lenin, but also by Marx and Engels in other places, this was, I suppose, attributed to a lack of clarity, in some instances, a lack of clear revolutionary drive. Blanqui, for example, from the very first, in the autumn, had wanted to make a move on Versailles and had wanted to, attack before they in turn were attacked. It could be argued there. It's also, I think, a certain ambivalence amongst some of the revolutionaries with the belief that that maybe if they held on and so on, other cities and so forth might come to their rescue, and that simply by existing, that they could, they could maintain their position. You also had this rather strange paradox that that the Bank of France, which was obviously quite a central element, which was where the gold reserves were, wasn't seized and used by the Commune. Indeed, it was still in a sense linked to Thiers' government, and it was being used, or at least the gold in it was being suggested as collateral for the negotiations with the Prussians. So again, the seizure of an important resource like that would have been, I think, very significant. There's also, I think, probably at this stage as well, an uncertainty about what the reaction would be in the rest of France. In a sense, having seized control, the hope would have been that the other parts of France would have risen before. So there is something of a phony war, as it were, or rather a phony peace, because Thiers is making speeches about reconciliation and not wishing to advance on Paris, but of course he does. And between May the 21st and May the 28th, the so-called Bloody Week, he moves on Paris. Again, he does this with the cooperation of the Prussians. They allow his troops to come into the north of the city, which had sort of previously been off limits, as it were, to French soldiers. and this area was poorly defended by the Commune. And from then on, it was a case of moving through the city and capturing buildings, barricade fighting, but also increasingly simply a massacre. Marx, in an appendix to the Civil War in France, quotes a number of British newspaper reports describing how people are simply arrested, and then officers come along and just pick people at random, take them away in detachments, and then, as the newspaper reporter says, you can hear the sounds of gunfire. So this was in effect, a punitive repression. And as I've said, probably something like 30,000 people died in that repression. So it's really a very ruthless suppression of the Commune. The last stand of the Commune takes place in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Montmartre, and the wall in which, in a sense, they made their last stand is still there. It's known as the sort of wall of the Federals, or the wall of the Communards, probably better in more modern language. And in the months that follow, there are widespread arrests and indeed a suppression of the working class movement. So the Commune then is in many ways a heroic failure, but it's also a symbol of working class rule. Above all, I think it is a heroic event. The resistance of the Parisian workers, particularly women, who played a very important role. When I did this talk in another form before Christmas, I mentioned Louise Michel, an anarchist and very much a sort of symbol of the Commune. She carried out heroic resistance. So in that way, it showed the absolute determination. It also, I suppose, points the way to the idea of working class power and the nature of what a workers' state will look like. But it also, I think, points out the lack of clarity, probably amongst even the more left-wing elements of the Commune, about the nature of the state, and in particular, this idea that it has to be smashed and confronted, and that leaving a powerful enemy on your doorstep to arm and prepare, leaving key resources like the Bank of France effectively in their hands so that they can use its credit. All of that, I think, shows some lack of clarity. But what it does bring into the Marxist tradition is this emphasis on the democracy of the Commune, and the sort of demands that comrades make in meetings about an MP on a worker's wage, or the recallable nature of delegates, and the democracy in the working class movement. These are directly taken from the Commune. Whenever anybody is talking in that way, they're actually echoing the demands of the Commune. So in a sense, we're all communard. We're all part of that movement. And someone who thinks a sense of history, in a sense of the inspiration of history, is very important for our movement. I always feel greatly inspired reading about the Commune. And like many people today, I will be thinking of that sacrifice and that heroism, and what we can learn by being ourselves successful in our struggle for socialism today. So thank you, comrades.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Fascinating as always. This is really a huge part in our history, and I did look at this before. The role of women in the Commune is interesting. You've touched on it. It's actually, as I understand it, it was milkmaids who raised the alarm when the troops came in to take the cannons away. It was women who formed sort of human barriers between the National Guard, the working class, and the government as it was trying to take away the cannons, and they played a huge role in winning over some of these soldiers, as I understand it. And is also, I think it has something to do perhaps with Proudhon as well, because he was still a very popular figure on the left there in France, and he had a very terrible idea, not just about he should run things by himself, more or less by people appointed by him, but also his view of women was pretty misogynist, and they were pretty, they're feeble and weak, and they're good for prostitution and for marriage, was basically his idea. But that's an interesting, Louise Michel, as I understand it, was not actually keen on, or didn't make suffrage a key point of what she was fighting for as an anarchist. She concentrated, I think, on the right to work, for women to work and to bear arms. Quite right. But the right to vote was obviously important. But at the time, I think the National Guard was mainly made up of military people, so it was mainly men who were, formed, who transformed from the military to the National Guard, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why there weren't so many women involved at the time. Plus, there was no actual no country around that had suffrage for women at that time. But that was fascinating. So please, comrades, if you want to engage in the talk, ask questions or make comments, please raise your hand. And I'm sure lots of comrades have lots of questions.
My apologies. I've got a problem with my computer. My screen is entirely blank, so I can see no comments on the chat.
Okay, no worries. I'm keeping my eye on it. Okay, Dave, could you please switch on your video so I can bring you in? First, hello.
Yeah, hi. Oh, Kevin, that was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of very different questions, brief questions. One is, twice in your speech, you talked about the rest of France, and people in the communards were hoping for support from other areas in France. Did that actually happen? From what I know of the social structure of France at that time, which is not terribly much, I mean, there were other industrial cities like Lyon, and of course the coal mining areas of the north. And I wonder what were there any insurrectionary movements in support of the Paris Commune at that time? And I have an unrelated question, if I could. My partner is from Finland, and so I have read some really devastating stuff about the Finnish Civil War, the Reds and the Whites, mainly the Under the North Star, which is perhaps the most famous book in Finland. Anyway, the question I want to ask is about women. After the Reds had been defeated by the Whites in Finland, the treatment of the women, the treatment of the women was far worse by the oppressors, by the Whites, than it was of men. And they were called all sorts of things. I can't remember what, but like the Red Devils or something. They were far worse. Was there any of that? Was there any of that gender dissimilarity in the aftermath of the Paris Commune? Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. This is kind of a superficial question. I saw Les Miserables a couple of months ago. How close does the novel adhere to the facts of the Paris Commune?
Thank you, Steve. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, comrades. No, I think it was a good discussion, and thanks to Kevin for that. I think the interesting thing, I mean, there's lots of interesting things about the Commune and how influential it was. I mean, I think what was said by the comrade just now, I don't think that Les Miserables is actually about the Commune. It's about another uprising. There are so many uprisings in France. That's the thing about it. But I think the influence of the Commune, particularly as the first, really truly proletarian uprising, was very profound, and particularly into the Russian Revolution. And of course, it still has that influence today, and it's still still seen as an important event, particularly by obviously the French working class is still quoted, which is important. And I think what it does is it actually opens up certain things about the nature of the working class itself and its politics, in terms of the fact that it's egalitarian, which comes through, and it tends to come through any workers' uprising. You can see it very clearly in the Commune. The fact that it's democratic, and seeks to have a democracy which is then where representatives are also accountable and can be recalled at any point, and where representatives are not separate, as in the conditions of capitalism, where representatives actually, of course, are paid and treated as completely separate to the people they're supposed to be representing. And the Commune, of course, maintained its representatives as having the workers' wage. So why that's such an important demand that representatives not be separated from the people they're representing. And I think the other thing, as Kevin brought out, it was also, of course, it's internationalism in a period in which obviously there's a war being fought out between the Commune. Didn't discriminate between people in different countries and promoted people. Commune fighters were frequently from various parts of the world, including particularly Poland. Appointed a German minister of labour in the middle of a war which is technically in the middle of a war against Germany. So all very important principles. I think the other thing is the nature of its failures and how. And the lessons that Marx takes, and the lessons that Lenin, as Kevin says, takes. I think firstly, as he says, it's interesting actually, of course, is that both the Commune and, of course, the revolutionary Barcelona in 1936 failed to take on the banks and failed to take control of the key, one of the key elements of the state and the power of the capitalist class. That is the bank in the case of Commune. Bank of France does not enter into it. In the case of Barcelona, obviously Bank of Spain, and this is critical. Obviously, that any revolutionary organisation should, by its very nature, take over the banks. The second thing is also the issue of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is obviously also a wider principle. I think that really that given, which applies, quite clearly can be seen applying today, which of course is that if you, under conditions in which you have a position, where the working class is in a position to suppress its enemies, then it should do so, and be resolute about it. And the point is, to obviously the Commune should have taken on Versailles when it had the chance and crushed it, and appealed to the rest of the country. You can see that also, even today in the Labour Party, Corbyn should have crushed the right wing and flattened them. If we have the chance to take these people out, we should take them out, no question. I think the other thing, of course, is that Marx's great lesson that he takes, which is that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the existing structures of the state and use them for its own purposes. It has to smash them up and build its own, which may involve some of the same people, but will be structured for its own purpose. And this applies today. I think this is how you have to see, any bourgeois state institution, whether that's parliament or local councils or anything else, that in fact that they are not ours, and therefore we should behave like, we should understand that in dealing with them, that they're not ours, and we can't use them in the way that we would use our own instruments. And we have a fundamental hostility to the entire way these things are put together, and they will not serve our purpose. They serve the purpose of the people who built them and who control them in many different ways. And I think that's very profound in terms of an understanding of a method of operation. Anyway, thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Matthew. Kevin, do you want to reply to a few things?
Yeah, sure. Can I just apologize because my screen is entirely blank, so I hope that I hope that I'm getting through. Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, on the other movements, yes, there were, Dave, there were movements in the other cities, Lyon, Toulouse, Marseille, and there were some smaller movements. I'm not aware of anything in the Nord department. I'll actually have a little look around for that. And I think that's interesting, because I think that that there were in fact strikes. There had been tradition of industrial unionism there. Those of us who were familiar with the novel Germinal, which actually is sort of set in these years. If you remember, there's a delegate from the International, Pluchart, who is mentioned, and so on. But I think that this again sort of points to maybe the significance of Paris, and particularly its concentration of workers, and the coal mines, both in Britain and I think in France, are often slightly physically isolated. I mean, we often forget now. I mean, the coal fields I'm most familiar with were often quite rural. I mean, there were coal mines in and around larger cities, but the Nord department is somewhat isolated in France. But I will check that and try and get back to you by the end of the session, if I can do that technically. On the women's question, the treatment of women, certainly in the propaganda, the idea that women were incendiaries, that these were the people who were setting fire to the buildings as the commune was being suppressed. And some of the eyewitness accounts do talk of women who were just more or less shot out of hand, that they're, there's an account of a woman who is just sort of shot, thrown into a grave, and then is left there for a few days, is heard crying in the very hastily scraped over pit, and is then rescued and saved. So in that suppression, women would, I think, have been fairly ill treated. And I think all the class and all the other resentments, particularly the idea that any woman who was taking part in a movement like this was of a pretty low status, was little better than a prostitute, probably, completely immoral, and therefore deserved any punishment that she got. So some of the more notorious women were, in a sense, held up. As we know, with later women revolutionaries, often the bourgeois press and others have a certain fascination, which is quite prurient. And in my lifetime, I can remember all sorts of female revolutionaries, or sort of, sort of held up as these sort of sinister figures, not at all behaving like women should do in that way. So as a challenge both to the sort of status of women, the way that women should behave, and then of course they're all from a lower social class, they were treated, I think, fairly badly. And the deportations of some of them, would be indicative of that. Just a little point on the Finnish Civil War. I don't know a great deal about it, Dave, but one thing I do know, in my professional area, which is Irish history, there's quite a debate on it, because of course the casualties in that civil war, which I think lasts for around about a year, are somewhere in the region of 30,000 to maybe 40,000. And if you were to run through all the countries of Europe and try to guess which one had a fairly ferocious civil war, Finland would probably not be the top of most people's list. And of course, there was a very reactionary regime there, the General Mannerheim regime, which of course later collaborates with the Nazis. Again, that aspect of reactionary counter-revolutionary history is not always brought out. So I'm glad you mentioned it, and actually there could well be a session for a future LLA education there, Dave, on Finnish revolutionary history in that way. Just in reference, Steve, Matthew's right. Les Miserables is the Victor Hugo novel, is actually set in the period from about 1815, I think, to about 1830. And it draws on an earlier revolutionary tradition. So it's not about the commune. Although some of the features of the commune that that we're familiar with, you know, are to be found there. In particular, the barricades and you know, mass action, the great days of the revolution. There is an interesting point about what we might call the revolutionary style, and I know this may sound a bit cultural studies, and so I'm rather leery of using it, but I think that revolutionaries often do draw from the experience of previous revolutionary movements. And in France, where there's such a strong revolutionary tradition, then emulating the great days of the revolution, of, for example, occupying buildings, establishing barricades, you know, defending buildings, intervening in public life, seizing the National Assembly. These sorts of you know, manifestations, as literally as they are in French, are, I suppose, part of a tradition which is obviously very potent. Now, of course, if it's just a sort of performance, you know, it becomes then just a sort of routine, you know, and it doesn't really challenge. But it is a very powerful tradition that can be drawn upon. And so drawing upon the sort of things that Hugo describes, you know, will be important for the Communard. Interesting, I was having a quick look at some views, and Hugo actually was, I think, fairly dismissive of the Commune at the beginning, but he then describes, you know, the repression, and although he, you know, he's not a particular sympathizer with them, but he does support the idea of an amnesty, and he condemns the repression in that way. So you know, that's his contribution to that. Matthew, yeah, you drew, I think, some quite important points there. I think the interesting thing is really the relationship between the economic and the political. And I suppose, given the sort of Proudhonism and maybe the Blanquism of many of the leading people, the idea of the economy being a powerful instrument, I think may well have, in a sense, not passed them by, but their main focus was on seizing symbolic buildings. I mean, the fact that they focused on the town hall, the Hôtel de Ville, or the you know, the calling themselves the Committee of Public Safety, and so on, does to me seem to suggest that they see this movement purely in political terms. You know, it isn't just a case of seizing the means of communication, but of course, in having control of the gold would have given the Communard, you know, a great deal of power. And I suspect that the Proudhonists focus on small-scale production and you know, very much the sort of independent petty bourgeois, meant that they didn't regard the centralized economy or the commune taking control of that economy and directing it in that way. And then likewise, the Blanquists, who seem to focus on revolution as a political act, you know, organized in a conspiratorial manner, which is quite effective in certain moments, but is very much based upon the idea of taking control of the situation rather than, I think, encouraging the self-organization of workers. So I think that the importance of the economic instrument that you drew attention to was one that many of them, you know, tended to underestimate. The Bolsheviks, of course, wouldn't underestimate that, and they were very clear about the importance of seizing not only key points, but also in maintaining production and maintaining some sort of social order in society. And it was obviously a very it was a very hard struggle, as I hope we'll discover in some of the education sessions that are coming up after Easter. But the Bolsheviks faced some of the same problems of isolation, but had in a sense attempted to spread their revolution and their program for the peasantry. The way that they they dealt with those questions was, I think, quite significant. I'd just like to return just briefly. It just occurs to me in terms of Dave's point about the spreading of the movement, and that, of course, is that although Paris was the largest population centre, and although the proletariat was numerous, the working class, the classic working class, was still, I think, a minority of the population. The peasantry was still a large force, and that intermediate group of petty bourgeois and artisans and so on, petty proprietors and skilled tradespeople and so forth, was still sufficiently numerous, and France was still sufficiently a rural society to enable the party of order, the rurals group to to be in a much stronger position. So in many ways, Paris seized the initiative, but I'm not sure that it, beyond the idea that other cities would take up the cause, I think that little was done to spread it, although of course it was effectively under siege and it was quite difficult. And again, that comes back, I think, to revolutionary perspectives. Paris often had, as I said, a sort of vanguardism, believing that if it led, people would follow. And of course, in the great days of the revolution, that happened. But I think in this period, politics are changing, and the need for parties and for groups that cover the whole country, is starting to be realized. It's only after the Commune that the French workers' movement really begins, I think, to form seriously. And it obviously draws inspiration from the Commune, but it's starting to move away from a focus on the petty proprietor, the sort of Proudhonist approach. Is starting to move towards a much more specifically proletarian orientation. Anyway.
Thank you, Kevin. I think you should write some kind of handbook, how to make a revolution. As you were talking, it occurred to me, really could do something like that. Okay, we have a few questions in the Q&A. I think Carol is asking hers in person. Michael has asked me to read his out, Michael Craig. He says, the national government used an appeal to the Republic to win people away from supporting the Commune. How much effect did this have? Okay, now Steve Freeman and then Carol.
Yeah, thank you. I've unmuted myself. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That was excellent talk and got to all the key points highlighted. I wanted to just take a slightly different angle, although just to emphasize a couple of things about its impact on, well, two things about more to do with England actually than France. So if you go back to the 1820s and 30s, the two key ideas in the English working class movement were republicanism and Owenite cooperation. And if you went on a demonstration, a workers' demonstration, 1820s and 30s, you would see French tricolours, you would see the Cap of Liberty, you would see even the American Stars and Stripes, because there was that radical Republican tradition in the working class movement. And then, of course, Owenite cooperative movement was also very important. And Marx himself began really as a radical Republican, influenced himself by the French Revolution, not really as a communist at that point. And then, of course, at some point along the line, in the 1840s, he becomes a communist. And when he becomes a communist, and of course that goes into the writing of Capital and all those other things. When he becomes a communist, he kind of rejects that republicanism. There's a sense in which he's rejected that republican tradition. So in a way, communism is seen as an alternative to republicanism. And then when we get up to this period, Marx, in a way, rediscovers his republicanism through the Paris Commune, because he, at this point, he realizes, in fact, that there's a different kind of republicanism that we can find here in the Paris Commune that sheds this tremendous light on what he understands by a republicanism for the working class. And you mentioned all the points, but I want to emphasize them. One, the executive and the legislature are fused into one, that everybody is elected, accountable, and subject to recall, and paid the average salary or average wage or whatever. Those, I think, were the key things that Marx, the key Republican takeaways, as it were, from the Paris Commune that Marx rediscovers in a sense. And he understands that this republic leads, it's opening the door. So republicanism here is opening the door to the possibility of communism. And as you say quite rightly, the communards didn't take the Bank of France, they didn't take even any of the commanding heights. So they didn't get to the economic argument in the way you've already explained to us. And in a way, what's happening here is a sort of dual power between the one type of republicanism, which is the Thiers Republic of Versailles. That's one republic, becomes a third republic. And then this other republic, which coexists alongside it as a dual power situation, the rivalry between two powers. And of course, the Paris Republic, the Paris Commune Republic, remains in one country, in one city, not even in one country, and therefore is defeated in all the ways that you've outlined. So I think that there is a rediscovery of Marx's republicanism in a new way, in a new form, and what he learned from this process. Now, my last point is this. There was also in England quite a lively republican movement in the 1870s, led by Bradlaugh, Charles Bradlaugh and others, and Marx's Land and Labour League was involved in that. And it was seen to be quite powerful. There were republican clubs all over the place. So there was a genuine popular republican movement, which is dead, literally dead by 1874. It dies out completely and disappears almost. It's the last time there's any kind of republicanism in England. But the Paris Commune, the defeat of the Paris Commune, is also the dying out of republicanism in England at the same time. And of course, at the same time, Queen Victoria, who's very unpopular, then Disraeli resurrects her in 1874, makes her Empress of India, and then monarchism is rebuilt again. So what's happening in England is also reflected in the democratic movement that was taking place in the early 1870s, when the working class was still trying to get the vote after Chartism and things like that. So there is a connection between, between England, what's going on here, and what's going on in Paris and France.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, Carol, could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I was really, really shocked to learn that 30,000 people were killed, and then there was more. More people deported and imprisoned, and just horrific numbers. Given that there was that many people in the commune working together in this sort of really, really wonderful way, how did the army, the French army, how did they manage to defeat them so quickly? How did they manage to get through Paris so quickly and inflict such terrible vengeance, really, on these people?
Thanks, Carol. Kevin, we have no more questions or contributions. There's one question in the Q&A, a new one from Jerry. Says, Lenin identified the Paris Commune and its organizational forms with the Soviet organizations that emerged in 1905 and 1917. Is this agreed? Asked Jerry, and he describes himself as having been accused of Soviet fetishism.
Yeah, they're sort of linked in various ways. My apologies. I'm having technical problems here, so I can be heard, can't I?
Yes, all good.
Right, okay. First of all, Michael, Well, it's true that France was formerly a republic in 1871, but in the years that were going to follow, the various monarchist parties, the Legitimists and the Orleanists, did jockey for power, and that republic was certainly a very conservative one. Thiers was a closet monarchist. MacMahon, who was descended from Irish emigres in the 18th century, the so-called wild geese, he was a quite open monarchist, and when he became president, really attempted to restore the monarchy. So the republic, although the idea of the republic, is a powerful one in France, many of the rural notables who were the basis of the new state were fairly conservative. So any appeal to the republic would, I think, in their eyes, be to a very conservative republic rather than anything particularly radical. So the idea of a republic, can take many different forms. In France, its revolutionary history does make it a revolutionary idea, but as we can see, for much of the late 19th century, in the Third French Republic, it's a fairly conservative set of institutions. Although, of course, in the Europe of the 19th century, the idea of republicanism was radical in that sense. I think Steve is right to talk about the importance of democracy, and I think that what the Commune gives to Marx is a living example of working class people attempting their own self-government. So rather than thinking of it as an abstraction, he actually had a living example. And I think one of the important things about Marx and Engels, although it's often put to them as a rather put down, I think it was Mark Carney who put Marx down by saying that he spent all his time writing the Communist Manifesto in the British Library. Well, he wasn't actually. He wrote it in Paris and Brussels. But Marx and Engels were not just theoreticians. They were people who were in living contact with the history going on around them. And Marx's first ideas, as Steve is right to say, very much based on the Chartists. I mean, his idea that the proletariat could be a class for itself and in itself, those ideas were based on his observations of Chartism. This was not somebody sitting down in the study and conjuring up a set of ideas about wouldn't it be nice. He was looking at these real movements. And I suppose that the focus on democracy was very much in contrast to those of the more conspiratorial socialists, or indeed even those of the Owenite school that you mentioned, who often combined or Fourier, Saint-Simon, or others, who often combined a sort of technocratic or almost sort of Fabian elitism in their attitude towards the working class. So this, I think, is a sort of prime example of that for Marx. He actually now begins to see how a future society could be organized. And of course, that then feeds into the programs that the various social democratic Marxist parties develop in Europe after the Commune. So this experience is then built into their program. And on the reading list, I've given a section over from Lenin, State and Revolution, where he has a whole section on the experience of the Commune. Tina, I don't really need to write a handbook for revolution because Lenin and quite a lot of other people have done it for us. So, and have done it a lot better. I mean, they were successful, and I'm not sure that we have been anywhere near as successful as they have. So until we're actually have actually achieved it, I think we should leave the handbooks there. But anyway, that's just an aside. I mean, we obviously do have to go on developing ideas in that way. The point about about the dual power that you make, about the two sort of republics. Well, I think that you know, Paris, in a sense, reacted to events. In many ways, it was born out of the defeat of the war, the sense of betrayal. So there was a sense of national humiliation. There'd been all the privations of the siege. And then the government, in a sense, tries to impose its will. So the seizure of the cannons is, you know, is a symbol of that. But perhaps more importantly, draws back to the earlier periods of the revolution or earlier revolutions. And workers, I think, knew that if they were armed and they were organized, then they were a power. And they didn't want to surrender that. And if you think about the way that other revolutions were often overwhelmed, it was when their armed power was reduced, when, for example, the barricades came down or when their guns were taken away from them. So I'm not sure, I think at this point, you know, many of them saw what they were doing as defensive, but then in a way they were forced to go on the offensive or should have gone on the offensive in that way. On the point, the point that Carol makes about the casualties and so on, well, the army was largely made up of what would have been regular troops, although some conscripts as well, and many of them had been prisoners of war, being held by the Germans for several months, and were then brought back in to deal with the insurrection. A week to capture a city, well, possibly, but it was done fairly ruthlessly, and it was done with no real finesse. It was simply just cutting their way through. And although the National Guard was armed, probably only the estimates of the actual numbers of people under arms would be somewhere around about 20 to 30,000, maybe as many as 50, but not as well armed as the troops that they were encountering. They also, at various stages, they also used particularly reactionary troops from various parts of France, particularly the Bretons, who were sort of famously royalist, and again, who were quite, you know, were often quite anti-Parisian. One of the things that you might consider in terms of, and this perhaps goes into the question that Michael answered, and maybe even Dave as well to a certain extent, was that there was often a sort of anti-Parisian feeling that could be mobilized. And the idea that those people in Paris were causing trouble again, and that we rural types were going to go and sort them out. You know, I think often was a way of mobilizing people. So local loyalties, and of course, you know, in the countryside and amongst the peasantry, these are often, you know, some of the most, you know, politically backward people. So I think that might explain the numbers that they could get in that way. Then just lastly, a quick response to Jerry. I think I'm not sure that the commune is a Soviet, but what I think it is a new form of government. The difference between it and a Soviet is its geographical designation, although Soviets took all sorts of forms. But it does have similarities with Soviets. And above all, it is a set of institutions that have been thrown up by the working class to you know, to rule and to organize their struggle. And the commune, like the Soviets, does take on governmental forms and will be the basis of Soviet power. So I think that whether you have a fetish about Soviets or not, Jerry, they're certainly comparable. They're attempts by the working class to form initially defensive structures dealing with strikes and protests, and then in particular situations acquiring a governmental form, and, you know, showing not only the capacity of the working class but the desire of the working class to govern and to take control of society in that way. So I'd like to thank the comrades. I think that the commune is important. I think its importance is in the emphasis on democracy and on the potential of the working class to govern as the dominant, as the ruling class. And this is the first workers' government, and as such, we should celebrate it and we should remember. We should also remember not only the heroism, but also in the way, and this really comes through in Marx's pamphlet, where he's absolutely scathing about Thiers and his various counter-revolutionaries. The nature of these people, that these are the ruling class of France. These are the people who will dominate France, into the rest of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And this is their republic. So a republic, a reactionary republic of this character is not democratic, and the Commune very clearly was. And Marx draws attention to that. And of course, that memory lingers on long in France. It lingers very well into the 20th century. It still is there today. Indeed, one of the big disputes in late 19th century French socialism, about participation in bourgeois governments, the participation of Mitterrand in a cabinet with Gallifrey, who was one of the generals who suppressed the Commune, who personally took part in executions, who picked people from the crowds and then lined them up in firing squads. The hatred that was felt towards him, but more importantly, the hatred felt towards that ruling class, was very strong in the French socialist movement. And I think we should remember how a ruling class will behave when threatened. And that means that we should learn the lessons of the Commune, which is that when we have the chance, that we should strike as hard as they will, because they won't give us a second chance. And that's one of the lessons of the Commune. So heroism, sacrifice, and above all, the aspiration for democracy and for workers' power, but also we have to be as determined as the ruling classes in defending their system when we have the chance to build and create our new system and overthrow theirs. So thanks, comrades.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, comrade.